The first thing the plot showed was a cloud of dots, clustering not in the Balkans, not in the Middle East, but on a stretch of sun-baked land in northwest India. The dots were made from the genomes of Romani families living across Europe, and the result was not subtle. I still remember looking at that figure, because half a millennium of European folklore had just been fact-checked in a single afternoon. In December 2012, a team led by Isabel Mendizabal and David Comas at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona published their findings in Current Biology. They had sampled DNA from 152 Romani individuals across 13 European countries and compared it to thousands of reference populations worldwide. When they plotted that data, the dots pointed unambiguously to a region that today straddles Punjab, Rajasthan, and Haryana. The genetic signature was so stark that the map almost did not need a caption, and yet almost nobody outside a few laboratories saw it coming. So here is the question I want to chase with you. If the Roma are not who Europe said they were, who are they? And why did it take a genome study in 2012 for the rest of the world to say it out loud? This is also a story about how we write history and whose words get to count. Before the genetics, there were names. The English word gypsy is built on a wrong guess. It began as a shortened form of Egyptian, because people in medieval and early modern Europe looked at dark hair, dark eyes, and a traveling life, and decided the Roma must have come from Egypt. The French called them Bohemians, a guess that tied them to Bohemia. In much of Central and Eastern Europe, they were called Tsigani, Tsigani, Zigeuner, words that descend from a Byzantine Greek term, Atsinganoi, originally applied to a heretical sect. In 16th century Spain, they were Gitanos, again a twist on Egyptian. And then there was the most stubborn mistake of all, the idea that Roma had something to do with Romania. It does not. The word Roma comes from Rom, meaning a man or husband in Romani, from an Indo-Aryan root connected to a community in India, a word that itself is one of the oldest clues in this whole puzzle. I will come back to that word, because its shape travels straight back to the subcontinent. Here is the thing. Every one of those names is a claim about where these people came from, and almost every claim was wrong. That matters more than you might think. If a host society names you after a place you have never seen, it writes you into a story where you are always foreign, always just arrived, always suspect. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European chroniclers added nastier stories, that the Roma were Egyptians cursed to wander for refusing shelter to the Holy Family, or that they were Turkish spies, or that they practiced sorcery. The folklore was not harmless. It became a legal argument for expulsion, branding, enslavement, and, in the 20th century, extermination. When the English Parliament passed the Egyptians Act in 1530, it ordered all Egyptians to leave the realm within 16 days on pain of death, and any who stayed could be executed simply for being who they were. That is not metaphor, it's statute. The first real break in that story did not come from a laboratory. It came, as these things often do, from a student being curious in the wrong place. According to a story long repeated by scholars, a Hungarian theology student named István Vályi was studying in the Netherlands around 1760 when he met several Indian students from the Malabar coast. Vályi knew the Romani spoken in his homeland, and he noticed something strange. Words in their speech sounded like the Romani he knew. He began writing down words and comparing them, and he reached a startling conclusion. The language of the Roma he had grown up around was related to the languages of India. Vályi's flash of insight was, in a way, the first genetic test, phenotype-free, just ears and a notebook. And it was corroborated a few decades later by Johann Rüdiger, a German scholar who independently made the same connection in 1782 after listening to Romani prisoners of war. Both men saw what generations of clergymen and tax collectors had missed, that the strange tongue of the itinerant metalworkers was not thieves' cant, but a sister of Sanskrit. If Vályi's observation was the spark, the German linguist August Friedrich Pott turned it into a bonfire. In 1844 and 1845, Pott published a massive 2-volume study of Romani. He laid out systematic sound correspondences between Romani and Sanskrit, Hindi and Punjabi. Linguists had already used this comparative method to map the deep history of Europe's languages. Now the same method pointed unambiguously east. Romani did not borrow a few exotic words. It was an Indo-Aryan language. Water in Romani is pani, exactly as in Hindi and Punjabi. The word for house is care. The word for night is rat. The first person pronoun I is me, a direct echo of Hindi. Main, even the grammar gave the game away. Romani uses postpositions instead of prepositions, like Hindi, and its basic word order is subject-object-verb, a hallmark of the Indian subcontinent. These are not loanwords from a merchant caravan. They are bedrock vocabulary. I want to pause on this, because the word pani is a small proof of something enormous. A servant girl in a 19th century Transylvanian household asking for water was using a word that began on the other side of the world, and that girl almost certainly did not know it. Yet here is the strange part. The language evidence was overwhelming by the mid-1800s, but it changed almost nothing for most Europeans. A linguist might call the Roma Indo-Aryan. A police inspector in Paris or Berlin would still call them Egyptians and throw them out of the city. That is because language does not always control identity. The Roma were perceived as a race, and race was not understood by grammar. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, physical anthropologists measured skulls, skin color, and blood groups, and they produced the same old racial guesses dressed up as science. Cesare Lombroso, the father of criminal anthropology, wrote in 1876 that gypsies were a living example of a whole race of criminals, and claimed their skulls were a primitive type. In France, the police assigned each Romani person an anthropometric identity card with fingerprints and ear measurements, a system later copied by the Gestapo. The conclusion was almost always the same. The Roma were a problem, a mixed race, a dangerous inheritance. Those pseudo-scientific categories did not stay in books. In Nazi Germany, they became a death warrant. But before I cross that terrible threshold, I need to fill in the blank space between the language evidence and the gas chambers. Because while linguists were proving an Indian origin, another force was already shaping the Roma's fate in Eastern Europe. An institution so durable it lasted almost half a millennium, and so brutal it prefigured what came later. I am talking about slavery. In the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, today's Romania, the Roma were held as chattel slaves from the late 14th century until the middle of the 19th. They were categorized into three groups: slaves of the crown, slaves of the monasteries, and slaves of the boyars, the noble landowners. They could be bought, sold, exchanged for pigs or horses, used as dowry, and subjected to beatings, starvation, and humiliation that were legally sanctioned. The legal code of Prince Vasile Lupu in 1646 formalized the status, specifying that a runaway slave could be caught and punished without time limit, and that children followed the status of the mother. Slave markets existed in cities like Bucharest and Iași, where Roma were stripped and inspected. They worked as blacksmiths, entertainers, domestics, and field laborers, but their bodies were not their own. A visiting French abbot in the 1760s recorded seeing Romani slaves with iron collars welded around their necks, and he wrote that their masters treat them worse than beasts. Slavery in the Romanian lands was not a footnote. It was the economic bedrock for the nobility's lifestyle and the monastery's wealth. And it shaped the Roma's position in all of Europe, because when abolition came, after decades of campaigning by liberal revolutionaries and under intense international pressure, it released a landless, traumatized, and despised population into a continent that already hated them. Emancipation was enacted in stages. In 1843, the state slaves were freed, but private and monastic slaves remained in bondage. The revolutions of 1848 brought figures like Mihail Cogălnicianu and Ion Heliade Radulescu to the forefront, demanding full and immediate freedom. It took until December 1855 in Moldavia under Prince Grigore Ghica, and February 1856 in Wallachia under Prince Barbuș Bey, for slavery to be wholly abolished. The freed Roma received little land, no reparations, and enormous hostility. Many took to the roads, migrating westward into Central Europe, and their arrival fed the stereotypes of the rootless, criminal gypsy. What Europe saw as a natural state of wandering was, in large part, the aftershock of a forced labor system that had just collapsed. So when the Nazis built their racial state, they were aiming at a group that had been systematically dehumanized for centuries. I told you I would get to the dark part, and this is it, because the story of Romani genetics cannot be separated from the story of Romani persecution. The Nazis called the Romani genocide the porajmos, the devouring. Between roughly 220,000 and 500,000 Roma are estimated to have been murdered by the Nazi regime and its allies in ghettos, mass shootings, camps, and medical experiments. The racial pseudoscience that enabled it leaned heavily on the work of a single obsessive man, Dr. Robert Ritter, head of the Racial Hygiene Research Unit. From 1936 onward, Ritter and his assistant Eva Justin compiled genealogical dossiers on more than 20,000 Romani people, measuring nose bridges, eye color, and earlobes, and concluding that the Roma were an asocial primitive race of Indian origin who had been mongrelized by European admixture. On that basis, the Nuremberg laws were extended to Roma in 1935, and Heinrich Himmler ordered the deportation of all Roma to concentration camps in 1938. Ritter's signature is on the paperwork that sent thousands to their deaths, and after the war, he was never prosecuted. He went on to work as a school doctor and a government health advisor in Frankfurt, dying in 1951. His assistant Eva Justin completed a doctorate on Romani children, whom she then followed into the gas chambers. She later worked as a child psychologist for the Frankfurt police. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Roma families were held in a section known as the Zigeunerfamilienlager. It was overcrowded, typhus-ridden, and brutalized by block leaders. On the night of 2 August 1944, the SS drove those remaining, most of them women, children, and the elderly, into the gas chambers. The number that night is recorded as 2,897 souls. The date is now Roma Holocaust Memorial Day. One survivor, an Austrian Romani woman named Seha Stoica, was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau as a child. She survived, and she spent the rest of her life painting and writing about the camp, insisting that the Roma dead not be forgotten. In her memoir she wrote, "We are still alive, we have survived all that. Auschwitz was a death factory. They threw us into the gas chambers and we cried for our mothers." Her testimony is not a metaphor, it is a record. There were others. Philomena Franz, a Sinti singer who lost her mother, father, and brother, later wrote that, "They took away my childhood, my family, my language, and I was left with only the memory of suffering." The testimonies are sparse precisely because so few survived to speak. And yet, for decades after the war, German courts denied that the Romani genocide was racially motivated. In 1956, the West German Federal Constitutional Court ruled that the persecution of Roma before 1943 was merely a police action against asocial elements and not a crime against humanity. The same Robert Ritter's records were used to deny restitution to survivors, because the state argued they had been imprisoned for criminality, not race. It was not until 1982 that Chancellor Helmut Schmidt officially recognized the genocide, and it was not until 2012, the same year as that genetic study, that a memorial to the murdered Sinti and Roma was unveiled in Berlin's Tiergarten Park after years of bitter argument. So when the genomes clustered over northwest India that same year, it was a quiet double reckoning. Biology had finally done what law and memory had struggled to do. And so when that 2012 genome study landed, it was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a delayed vindication, a way of saying, look, this group you have spent centuries calling rootless has one of the most traceable roots in human history. Mendizabal and Comas's data showed that the Romani diaspora began with a single founding population of perhaps 1,500 individuals who left the northwest Indian subcontinent around 500 to 600 of the Common Era. They moved through Persia and the southern Caucasus, mixing with local populations there, and then entered the Balkans by the 11th or 12th century. That timeline aligns with historical events, the invasions of the White Huns and the Ghaznavid raids into northern India, which displaced many artisan and performer communities. From the Balkans they radiated outward, into the Carpathian Basin, across the Danubian plains, and into Western Europe by the 15th century. Every step left a faint genetic scar, a bit of Iranian DNA, a slice of Anatolian, a chunk of Balkan European, but the core Indian signature never washed out. In fact, more than 50% of Romani men carry Y chromosome haplogroup H1A1A-M82, a paternal lineage that is found almost exclusively in the Indian subcontinent and is virtually absent from non-Romani Europeans. That little piece of alphabet soup is a passport stub from 1,500 years ago, carried silently in blood cells. The genetics also refined the linguistic clues. The word, rum. The word they use for themselves is now understood to descend from the Indo-Aryan. Dom a name for a caste of itinerant musicians and metalworkers still found in India today. The Domba, as they are known, live on the margins of society and have long been associated with drumming, basket making, and entertainment. The phonetic shift from dom to rum is regular and predictable, the same way Latin, lupus, became Spanish, lobo. So when a Romani father in Manchester or Marseille calls himself rum, he is echoing an ancestral profession carved out in the villages of Punjab 2 millennia ago. That connection is not romanticism, it is a chain of sound changes and carbon atoms, and it is real. So this brings me back to the spine question. Why did it take a genome study in 2012 for the rest of the world to say it out loud? In part because the truth of Romani origins had been buried not by ignorance, but by active denial. Europe's self-image relied on a story in which it was the source of civilization, not a terminus for an advanced Indian caste that brought metalworking and music to the continent. And the Romani themselves, being stateless, enslaved, and exterminated, had no university departments, no archaeologists, no geneticists to publish their own narrative. The few who tried, like the writer and activist Marcel Courtiade, who spent decades cataloging Romani dialects, did so against a tide of indifference and hostility. Moreover, many Romani groups themselves have been wary of DNA testing, fearing that genetic data could be weaponized again, as it was by Ritter. But gradually, as younger generations of Romani scholars and human rights lawyers have taken the floor, the findings have been embraced as a tool of anti-racist education. The Romani national flag, adopted at the First World Romani Congress in 1971, features a 16-spoke wheel called the chakra, which consciously echoes the Ashoka chakra of India, an explicit claim to origins. The international anthem, Gelam Gelam, opens with the lines, I went on long roads, / I met happy Roma, and it references the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, tying Romani suffering to Indian suffering. The symbol is not a coincidence. It was a prophecy waiting for the science to catch up. What then does a genetic origin really mean? Does it override the language, the music, the 100 ways that Roma have built a culture that is neither Indian nor European, but a third thing, a culture of survival, of diaspora, of making a home out of a word and a song? The genome does not decide identity, but it does something quieter. It forces us to look at a map and see a line that crosses from the Punjab to the Pyrenees, drawn not by conquerors or chroniclers, but by a population that walked, generation after generation, with a few tools, a few words, and an iron will to remain. The same path that a theology student glimpsed in a few syllables in 1760, and that a DNA sequencer read in a few billion letters in 2012, was trodden by real people, fleeing war, escaping slavery, holding funerals by the roadside, who never forgot, at least in their tongue, that water is pani. That night is rat. And that a man, a husband, a person is still rum. So where does that leave the old names? Egyptian, Bohemian, Gypsy? They are now exposed as a series of wrong turns, but they remain embedded in laws, in epithets, in the memory of violence. The process of unlearning them is not just linguistic housekeeping. It is a reckoning with the fact that Europe built a category called Gypsy and then punished real people for fitting into it. And that, I think, is the hard moral the 2012 study drops in our laps. Origins can be proven, but history is not undone by facts. It is undone by the people who finally get to speak. I want to thank today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, for keeping my internet secure while I chase down obscure 19th century slave codes and wartime testimonies from archives I technically shouldn't have been browsing in the middle of the night. If you want to try it, there's a link down below, and using it supports this channel. Here is a warm aside to land on, because after 2 hours of writing about genocide and enslavement, I need a note of hope. The next time you hear flamenco guitar, that percussive rasgueado, the Phrygian scales that sound like a voice trying to escape, know that musicologists have traced that sound, at least in part, to the raga systems of Rajasthan. When Spanish Romani musicians gathered in the caves of Sacromonte, they were not just reinventing themselves, they were humming something their ancestors had carried across the Hindu Kush. That is not proof of anything, but it feels like the kind of evidence that matters most. The proof that a people can lose everything and still keep a rhythm. If you want to chase more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. It really helps, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.